I've wondered over the years that I've done this type of service, whether it is just a glorified ego trip, because it is in some ways. I sort of came up with this idea of Stump the Minister or Q&A Sunday, and Dillman may have experience with this from her own past in ministry, where it's a good opportunity for the congregation to ask questions of the minister. Now, typically what will happen is the questions will come in advance. The minister will pick the ones that he or she thinks are the best ones to try to answer, and then we'll do a service or sermon around those questions. I thought that was actually a little tacky. So what I've done for several years now is to insist that I not get any of the questions in advance. That is terrifying to some people, but I think to me, I really enjoy it because A, it's a challenge. B, I never know who asked the questions. C, I don't have time to think about the answers much. And there's, in the Zen tradition, which I come from, there's something called, and only Zen would call it this, Dharma combat. And it's a way for a teacher and their students to enter into dialogue. And it's pretty intense. And so years ago, I had this idea, well, we're not having a dialogue in the same way that they do there, but they do have a question and answer process. So a number of years ago, when I decided to start doing this, I thought it would be a good challenge for me. And who knows, maybe I would be able to help people learn some new ideas, and it would certainly teach me a thing or two. So what's going to happen is that Dillman and Sherry are going to come up, and they are going to read the questions twice. They'll take turns. And once we get through all the questions, because we are running a little bit early, I will open it up for any comments or questions that anyone might wish to ask because of those questions that were answered. Okay? So Dillman and Sherry, would you please come up?
Welcome to today's edition of Stump the Minister. That is revenge for every bad joke you've ever done. Question number 1. What? You mean they can't hear me? Question number 1. What are your views and perspectives on dissident and minority religious views within the UU congregations? How do you handle the tyranny of the majority on behalf of the minority? I'll read it again. What are your views and perspectives on dissident and minority religious views within the UU congregations? How do you handle the tyranny of the majority on behalf of the minority?
Good question. First of all, one of our principles talks about democracy, and democracy is the rule of the majority, and over time the majority changes. The millennial generation now has very few of the same similar ideas and passions that baby boomers had, for example. They see it as a very different world, like gay marriage, for example. I think the same is true in UU congregations in that we have to remember if we lose a particular battle, so what? We're part of a larger community, and if the larger community wants to, for example, change the service times like we did a couple years ago, well, that's what we agreed to do, but we agree also to revisit it. So, for example, in a lot of UU congregations, there are small, brave bands, and I've said this before, of Republicans, of Christians, of humanists in some, and they all grumble about not being heard, but they need to be welcomed and be able to speak out and, for example, have services so people could say, oh, that's why you're a dissident. Oh, that's why you're an extremist. And then we find out what we have in common. So I think the two answers would be that time will show that these things ebb and flow and go back and forth, and they change with every generation, and that what was a dissident group 20 years ago may in fact be the majority in another 10 years. Stuff changes.
A young man or lady in their teens approaches you for a consultation, during which time he or she announces that their sexual orientation is not the norm. Classmates have begun to notice their difference, and they have begun to be made fun of, close to being bullied. The parents are not yet aware of this situation. What do you, as a minister, do to counsel the teen, advise her parents? What would be the normal procedures? I'll read it again. A young man or lady in their teens approaches you for a consultation, during which time he or she announces that their sexual orientation is not the norm. Classmates have begun to notice their difference, and they have begun to be made fun of, close to being bullied. The parents are not yet aware of the situation. What do you, as a minister, do to counsel the teens, advise his or her parents? What would be the normal procedure?
Well, the first thing that I would say to the teen would be, you're not abnormal. You're a perfectly normal person. You're in the range, the spectrum of sexual orientation of humanity. The second question I would ask them is, how are your parents? Even though you haven't told them, what do you think would happen if you did tell them? Because at some point, either they already can guess or they need to know. So I'd ask that question. The third question I'd say or ask would be, have you found any companions who are safe for you to be in community with? Whether it's this congregation or whether it's people your own age or other resources. The next thing I would do is I would find out what things this congregation would have or the UUA would have in Boston, because there are very ample and robust resources for people who are wrestling with sexual orientation in their youth and young adult period especially. And I would find out what those are, but there's not going to be anything so critical as face-to-face sharing story, sharing safety for people in that situation. And the other thing that I would do is immediately go to the welcoming congregation team here, and I'd say, with their permission, I'd say, we do have an individual who is wrestling with their orientation now, and I need your advice about how we move forward. In other words, I'm not going to pretend that I know all the answers, but the welcoming congregation folks here who are working on this program for its next stage, and you'll hear more about that later, are the people who really know it well. So I would do that, and then I would ask the teen to what degree, if at all, this would need to be confidential, and that they would always have an open door to come in or to call. But those are the things that come to mind immediately.
Buddhism is sometimes accused of being passive in the face of systemic injustice, although I understand there is something called Western engaged Buddhism. How does your Buddhist religious perspective interface with the strong commitment to social justice, not only individual justice, but also systemic justice that is so prominent in Unitarian Universalism? Buddhism is sometimes accused of being passive in the face of systemic injustice, although I understand that there is something called Western engaged Buddhism. How does your Buddhist religious perspective interface with the strong commitment to social justice, not only individual justice, but also systemic justice that is so prominent in Unitarian Universalism?
For much of its history, Buddhism was in Asia until about 80 or 100 years ago. Most people in the West had never heard of it. Because of its roots having to be in relationship with the rather tyrannical governments and societies that it was in China and Japan and so on, it had to make accommodations, and it had to be focused on the enlightenment, the awakening of each individual, rather than honoring the four, what's called the Bodhisattva vows, the vows of the compassionate one. The Bodhisattva vows, which we take at Great Vow Zen Monastery, and most Buddhist communities do: beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The enlightened way, or the Buddha way, is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. All of those vows are nearly impossible to accomplish. I said nearly. They actually are possible to accomplish. But they probably, if you believe in reincarnation, take lifetimes. What happened in Asian Buddhism is they totally forgot about the first one. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Or it was said, you go to a monastery and you train for 25 years and you will go through the path of awakening. What happened here in this country, or in the West particularly, is that the fervent belief, especially in North America, of social justice and compassion and justice for all those who have been left out of the circle of privilege, touched Buddhism very deeply, because Americans were coming and saying, well, why don't you live what you talk about? So particularly in Unitarian Universalism and Buddhism, there's a very rich process going on of the social justice that we love to talk about and do, but don't have a theology whatsoever that we really can hold on to. And then in Buddhism, which has the theology and the philosophy and the psychology of awakening and becoming completely whole, but didn't apply that to other people. What we're doing, and what I see in other places in America and in Europe and other locations, is that there's a nice hybrid process going on where the social justice passion that so many have, like here, is being balanced by the ability to realize, for example, that we have to have compassion for ourselves just as powerfully as we have compassion for others. And in Buddhist teachings, and I've done this here, you have to first have compassion for yourself, and then reach it out to someone you love, someone neutral, someone with whom you've had conflict, and outwards, eventually, to all beings. And I think one of the problems in Unitarian Universalism is that since we don't have a theology that we agree on, that we wear ourselves out trying to do the right thing for everyone else, and then we get burned out. And that's one reason I've talked about neo-universalism lately, and also a new type of Unitarianism, of what could it look like when we do have a theological grounding. And of course I'm biased because I'm Buddhist, and I see it as matching really well, but I also see Christianity doing that as well, the teachings of Jesus. So it's kind of a long answer, but I think there's a way to make it more balanced. And I know people like Ted and Ellie, for example. I mean, God, you can't ask for more social justice folks than they are. And I think they get fed by the work that they do. But I've seen so many people in social justice circles get burned out because there's always so much to do. So you start with yourself, and you realize that every single thought, word, and deed you do in the course of your life affects the world. No matter how small it is. It affects the world positively, it could affect it negatively or neutral. Your choice is to decide what that's going to be. And that's mindfulness practice of being able to say, if I'm going to pass the car in front of me, it's going 25 miles an hour on a 50 mile an hour road, am I going to make a nasty gesture or look at that horrible driver who's only going 25 miles an hour? Now, there's part of me that would say, yeah, do it. And I might have done that in my 20s. But now I can think about, I don't know what the situation with that driver is. I don't know if they're ill, or if they have something else going on, or they might be incapacitated somewhat. I cannot step into their lives and say you're bad because you're driving 25 miles an hour. I have to look at it compassionately. So everything that I try to do, and I fail miserably most of the time, what I try to do is ask the question, how does it improve both myself and the other person? So if I do something wretched, it sure isn't going to improve me, and it's also going to hurt the other person. So that's what Buddhism and the tie of those two things is, I think.
Next one. Last week we heard a sermon about the end of the world. Is there an apocalyptic tradition or other end-of-time teaching in Buddhism? How does it compare to the various Western approaches? I'll do it again. Last week we heard a sermon about the end of the world. Is there an apocalyptic tradition or other end-of-time teaching in Buddhism? How does it compare to the various Western approaches?
I'm just wondering if everything's okay out there. I'm not going to do just Buddhism. I'm going to do Unitarian Universalism because we are, after all, Unitarian Universalists. So Buddhism's nice, but it's not us. So Buddhism, I would say that the main thing is that, is that in Zen tradition, particularly, the world ends every moment. Every breath we take is the end of the world. The out-breath is death, ending. The in-breath is rebirth. And that's why breath is so important in meditation practice. So it doesn't have a cosmology about the end of things as Western traditions have it. Unitarian Universalism, I've wondered over time if we might have some faint apocalyptic notions, where if all those people would just go away, then we could just, everything would be good. What strikes me, though, and I didn't hear the sermon last week because I was in Moscow, Idaho, is that there is a very powerful movement in the West right now of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic literature, theology, everything from the supernatural to just an astonishing amount of literature and music and religiosity based upon an end to things. And what I've been wondering for some time is whether or not we as a civilization, as a society, no matter what our labels we call ourselves, intuitively sense that something is getting ready to happen or is happening. And it could be, for example, climate change. Or it could be something else on the horizon that's going to change us fundamentally as human beings. I'm inclined to believe, and I mentioned intuition about teens earlier, that our intuition is our most powerful ally. And our intuition, I suspect, is telling us things. And we're wrestling with it by reading literature that draws us, for example. Or within the Christian community, the idea of a rapture. Or that things are just so crazy right now that we kind of want it all to go back to normal or slow down or do something. So I think there's a very strong tradition of that, but it's underlying a lot of in our culture right now. I don't think Unitarian Universalism has it as such, but I think we're drawn to it because in some ways we would love to see the world change in our favor. And if you look at the principles, they really speak about that a little bit as well. But Buddhism itself does not have a real notion of anything apocalyptic. And I've been learning a lot about Tibetan Buddhism because Deborah is studying it in Portland, Oregon as part of her MDiv. And Tibetan Buddhism is very analytical and very logical and very laid out. And it really speaks to the idea that when a life ends, it really doesn't end. It just goes on to the next stage. So that very visceral aspect of how do you live and how do you die, which is apocalyptic really, is you keep going. And that's a very different than Western tradition, which has a kind of a different flavor about what happens with death. It's not a very good answer, but that's the best I can do. And I'm sticking to it.
Two-part question. Do you believe in ghosts? And what role do you think ghosts can play in spiritual development? I repeat. Do you believe in ghosts? And what role do you think ghosts can play in spiritual development?
I've mentioned to some of you something that happened to me 2 years ago. And it was in September of 2009. My little sister, who I still miss her so much. It was really the family I had, and we didn't grow up together. And Jamie died accidentally one night in her sleep. And my brother Jesse, who's now my only brother, because I've had 3 siblings die in the last 2 years. And Jesse called me and he told me, and I somehow intuitively had a sense something was going to happen. And I went to a Buddhist retreat in California. I was living in Washington State. And I came back and I was on the road and I had this sudden sense of my sister Jamie someplace. In a very confused place, not a frightened place, but a confused place with strange colors and just confusion. So I pulled off to the side of the road and I just lived it for a moment of that presence of not a soul so much, but an essence. And I did metta practice, loving kindness practice, for a few minutes. I contacted my Zen teacher, Chosen Bays, the next day, and she said that her ex-husband had one time been driving across Texas and had suddenly had this very clear sense of a friend of his with him in the passenger seat. And he learned the next morning that his friend had died a few hundred miles north of that location about that time. I'd say what that tells me is that we don't know what happens after death. I'd like to believe in reincarnation, and that's kind of what I've been oriented towards through my life. I think that, if anything, what it tells us, these very mysterious things that happen, and it could be delusion, certainly, but what they tell us more is that we just don't know everything. And there's one place scientific instruments can't go, and that's to that moment after we die. So I think, if anything, the idea of a ghost, or any essence, if you will, is to teach us some humility, and that we have more to learn about ourselves and about how we treat life and death.
What brought you to Unitarian Universalism? What brought you to Unitarian Universalism?
I was in my mid-30s, and if you're a guy in your 30s, you go through a life crisis. Actually, it's the 20s, 30s, and 40s, I think. But I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was going through angst. I had just gotten sober in 1984, and I decided to quit Berkeley for my PhD because I really got the Reagan administration angry. And so I was really wrestling with, being in my 30s. And I talked to some friends of mine, and I said, maybe I need to go to a church. I'd never been to one. And they said, oh, that's simple. Go to a Unitarian church. You'll fit right in. They're all crazy just like you are. So I find what was called the First Unitarian Church of Berkeley. It was actually in Kensington, but the acronym was not a good one. And so on the second try, I found the church because it was hidden away. And I was thinking, do I really want to be in a church? I walked in the door. The woman who greets me is the director of religious education, and she welcomes me. And she says, you have a Maine accent. Where are you from? And I say, Lisbon. She says, I'm from South Portland. That was number one. That was a good sign. Number two was I went in and I saw a big auditorium, because it's a big church, and mostly gray hair. And I thought, do I really want to be here? But the summer minister was talking about Buddhism. Number two, this was good. Number three, the third week I was there, the DRE says, would you like to be on the RE committee and start getting this place organized? Number three. So it was all uphill from there.
It seems like people only get something out of the church if they're active. Do you agree with that? And how can we encourage new people and members to be more active here? It seems like people only get something out of the fellowship if they're active. Do you agree with that? And how can we encourage new people and members to be more active here?
Okay. You all heard all the thing about 20% of the people do 80% of the work. So that would be, let's do over here. The rest of you don't count. Most people come to a religious community, whether it's a Zen community or a synagogue or a temple or whatever it may be, because they want something. Something's not quite right. And because it's a religious community, that means it's a community, and that means it's got an organization to it. I happen to know for a fact that the religious education program always needs teachers. I know for a fact that the membership committee always needs more people. I could go on and on. The Sunday services committee always could use new and fresh ideas. If you are a part of a community, you have a couple of choices. One is to sit like a bump on a log and say, I don't like it. Or to say, this is okay, but you've been saying the same damn thing for 5 years. Or you can say, okay, this is an institution. I want to get involved, and let me see how I could make some change happen, because I am a Unitarian Universalist. I am a subversive. I am a religious radical. I want to make change too. And no one's going to stop you. So, for example, let's suppose you said you wanted to have multimedia content for regular Sunday services, which personally I think is a great idea. You would, and Jay and Sherry, but Jay particularly, when they came here the first Sunday I think I was here. And Jay and Sherry, in their own ways, have just done such a tremendous amount of work with Sunday services and with the website and communications, but really to say, how do we bring this place into the 21st century to make multimedia a norm? So, for example, I could have done a service where I would have used Pearl Jam's Just Breathe, and you would have seen a video. And then you could have talked about it, about what is the theological meaning or the spiritual meaning or the social justice meaning of this video, because it has all three. That's where social media comes in handy. So that's people stepping up and saying, I want this. And I think it would be good for the whole community if we tried it. So that is a way of being able to encourage. You don't have to become a committee chair or a board person. All you need to do is to be able to say, I would be interested in doing this one thing. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in the last several years is people run away from the C word, and the C word is committee. What I'm a big believer in now is short-range, short-term working groups. You work on a task, and if you're a new person and you know a lot about it, great, all the better. You get the task done, boom, you're done. You've sunset. Now you can take 6 months and relish your victory. You don't have to be on a committee so much as you need to be able to help us get to the next stage. So think of the groups like Sunday services or religious education or membership or others who could use new guidance, new advice, new ideas. Because that's one of the main things that drives a religious community into the future instead of holding on to the past.
How will you feel after leaving us after 2 years?
I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it here. This will be the hardest congregation of the 14 that I've been in. They've all been hard to leave. Well, no, one wasn't. Seriously, it was a bad situation. But they've all been hard to leave, but this one, there's an expression both in the 12-step community and in Buddhism about time, place, occasion, where it all comes together. Now, most of you know that I came to the Southeast for another purpose primarily than just doing interim ministry. It turned out that that was utterly unimportant. But doing the ministry with you and developing this relationship was the most important thing in my life. And even though you may tease me and I may tease myself about names, let me tell you, this 2 years, it's been 2 of the most fantastic years of my adult life. You have been absolutely incredible. And I've just seen so many changes because you were ready. All I needed to do was say, yeah, you're going to be fine. We'll just do some work together. We'll laugh some more. And we'll get over some of the issues that were plaguing you, and we'll move forward. That's exactly what you've done. So it's really going to be hard for me to leave. Now, fair warning. I've told you that I don't do long-term relationships well, except ever. However, a relationship, when it's coming to an end, is always difficult for me, as it is for most of us. So I may and probably will be apt to be cranky or more cranky. I may start being more testy or even more testy. I may find it hard to disengage or to engage. I will be grieving. In fact, I already have been for the last several months. Because I am going to miss you enormously. And as one of my colleagues said, because we do interim as our work, don't read the newsletter afterwards, because you're going to keep grieving. And you and your new minister are going to go in different directions than I would have ever imagined. And when it comes to my time to end with the chocolate party, don't forget that I'm going to have to let go of everything that we set out to do and just set out into the future, as will you. But it's really, I've been amazed about how deeply moved I have been by you and how much you have taught me about interim ministry and about being human and about being in the South. And you've given me the real blessing of being able to start stretching myself into some areas like theology, for example, and some ideas that I have about evolution that I don't think I would have dared say before. And I'm saying it to you and have said it because in a very deep way, I trust you. And as I've said to congregations or said to on the ministers' chat list over the months, said, this is such a great group of people and they've come so far and they've dealt with some painful issues. And what a great group. How could anybody go wrong? And I mean it. So we have a couple minutes. I'm just wondering if anybody has any follow-up, either questions or anything like that. Yeah. I think that's a sermon topic. Grace to me, and I'm using Kathleen Norris, who wrote a book called Amazing Grace, Quote a Vocabulary of Faith. Grace in many respects, can be gratitude. And I think that's its core sense of being grateful or having grace that we exist as we are. Now, the Western monotheistic traditions would say grace due to God or to Jesus or whatever. But in Buddhist tradition, it would be grace being grateful for this very moment of life, for example, that we're still breathing, that we still have a life, that we have a community. So grace is probably more down to earth. I just want to mention that 2 or 3 services I'm going to do in May. The Mother's Day service is going to be Mother's Day, and I know that terrifies some people, but we're going to look at the question of how is it for people in the GLBTQ community to be parents and to be really wrestling with that new dimension of what it means to be a mother. And then the other service I want to do in May is to talk about the drug war and the insanity of it, because I have some very strong feelings about it. We have time for one more question or comment. Why am I not surprised? You're a Unitarian Universalist. Of course it is. Okay, thank you. And I'm glad you did that, because what it says is that when it all comes down to the core of what we're about as human beings, and some of you went to the Charter for Compassion workshop we did at the Lay Academy. Compassion by any form, whatever it means, however we use it, however we say it, however we express it, compassion is a driving force that not only makes us human, but brings us into community. And every moment of every day gives us an opportunity either to hear it, or to express it, or to do it. And I cannot imagine any religious system in the world that doesn't offer it. And I would say that every person in this room, no matter what your diversity or maybe your dissident minority status, everyone here does compassion. And that's what holds us together. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for taking the time today to Stump the Minister. And there are at least a couple of other sermon topics in there. So why don't we close with a song which I actually despised for a long time, but because I thought it was a bit woo-woo, but now I began to really enjoy it. So let's please sing together number 212, We're Dancing Sarah's Circle.